Hi, Kathy. I'm actually from the building or the room where the press conference took place about an hour and a half ago.
Oh, so, and were you there were you witnessing the press conference? Did you see what happened?
I was there for the first bit, but I didn't stay for all of it because I had some meetings. But I saw him come in and take the first few questions for sure.
Well, tell us what tone did he set? What was your view of how he conducted himself and how people responded?
As he always does, he's here to generate enthusiasm for his cause, to explain his cause, to say that we're going to win, Ukraine is going to win. So he reassures his people and then says, but we need more kit from the West. So he is consistent. He's full of energy. I mean, I met him back in September. He's full of energy, full of life, and occasional quips and occasional sort of good one-liners. But he is like, people I think make too many Churchillian comparisons. But the one thing that Zelenskyy does do, he mobilizes language to fight a war. And that is similar to what Churchill did in 1940. This is Ukraine's hour where it either survives as a state or doesn't. And he's utilizing the weapon he has, which is leadership and language, to engage his people who do not need to be engaged because they are determined, but also to engage the Western allies as well.
Well, let's talk about that engagement and his, as you say, his regular pitch for more weaponry, more support from the West. We have Poland saying that they've delivered their first Leopard tanks to Ukraine today. The US announced new military aid. So there was a lot of support and actual, weaponry arriving. What more, in your view, needs to be done from the UK and others?
Well, when you say a lot, I mean, I think that people don't understand the scale of fighting a conventional war. The Ukrainians are going through thousands of artillery shells per day. Now, some people say 6, some people say 4, but they're certainly using 2,000 plus a day. And that is a phenomenal amount of just artillery shells. There's a debate about fighters, and fighters are important for sure, and air defense as well. I would say, look, I think your listeners should be skeptical because there are dangers here, because this is a very dangerous war for everybody, not only Ukraine. For me, the right course of action, but also the least dangerous course of action, is to give the Ukrainians the tools to finish the job. And the sooner they get enough of those tools to finish the job, 300 plus tanks, 500 plus armored personnel carriers, and enough money and ammunition to keep going, the less dangerous it is for them, because tens of thousands of Ukrainians have already died, but the less dangerous it is for everybody.
Well, is that the case, though? Because, there is, and I was talking just a minute ago with William Hague about this, because the more the West sort of piles in weapons and gives Ukraine what they're asking for, and, people are desperately sad to hear what is happening to the Ukrainian people. There's no doubt about that. But the more embroiled we get, the more risk there is, surely, of this escalating to a point where the world is involved.
Yeah, for sure. And if China starts to back Russia now, then you have a superpower proxy war between the two authoritarian states, Russia and China, and the free world in the shape of the United States, Canada, and the European Union. So no one is underestimating that, not least me, because I think it's important that we shape the narrative and explain truthfully what is happening. But if Russia wins here, we don't go back to normal. You have a brutal occupying government. You'll have thousands of people being killed a month. We will try to take the fight to a Russian puppet regime with tens of thousands of Russian troops here. You will have a large-scale insurgency warfare in Eastern Europe. You'll have a vast refugee flow, and you will have probably Putin then trying to destabilize Moldova, possibly Kazakhstan, and then activating Russian paramilitary terrorist groups in the Baltic republics. Putin has declared a Cold War against the West in 2007. And that is becoming more visceral and more dangerous and more unstable the longer he stays in power. And I do think we need to engage in realistic thinking and not magical thinking. For Ukraine to win, sadly, Russia needs to lose. And the more quickly it loses, the better.
Right. I mean, so how do you mentioned China there, and China's government has called for peace talks between Ukraine and Russia and urged all parties to avoid nuclear escalation. They appear to be maintaining this view that the West is fueling the conflict. But how should the West respond to what China's saying and, the prospect of China arming Russia, as you mentioned?
Yeah, I think very simple. Firstly, China has a positive role because, sorry, some lights are going out here. I presume they won't all go out. China has a positive role because China is probably one of the very few countries that Putin listens to. And if the Chinese say you must not use nukes, I think Putin will listen to that, as long as they continue to say that. China has a destabilizing role if China starts to arm Russia, and we know that Chinese companies have certainly helping the Russians to avoid sanctions, so they are playing a somewhat negative role here. This is not a moral equivalence, though, Kathy. There is a right and wrong here. Putin's Kremlin used his armed forces to invade another country and to kill tens of thousands of people here. They're stealing children and they're killing people. I just think we need to have a reality check. There is not a moral equivalence, and it's not as if Putin is suddenly going to wake up and say, that was a bad idea, I'll behave like a rational actor.
Well,
it ain't going to happen.
So just finally, is there another potential end to this that, you've seen sort of infighting amongst, well, there's the founder of the Wagner mercenary group, Evgeny Prigozhin, for example, has been highly critical of Russia's top...
Prigozhin is being squeezed now because his unbelievably violent and drugged up troops were needed when Russia was short of manpower. Now that they're not short of manpower, he and his group are being denied arms and effectively being squeezed out, or certainly are being sidelined from this conflict, because Russia is about to bring in another 150,000 troops that have been training for the last few months into new formed units to carry out yet more brutal offensives in Ukraine.
Right, but I wonder if that instability might sort of play into the West's hands in some ways, because Putin is not necessarily the most secure of leaders, or is that wishful thinking?
I'm afraid to say, I think most of that is wishful thinking. Not all of it. I mean, look, if Putin is overthrown in a putsch tomorrow, I think we'll all be relieved, depending on who comes next.
But it's not very likely.
People have been saying, the Russians will take to the streets because they can see how daft this is. I'm afraid all the polling shows, and Lord Ashcroft, who's on our trip, did some big polling in the Daily Mail today to show that actually the Russians are almost as much behind Putin as the Ukrainians are behind Zelenskyy.
Yeah.
So the idea that people are suddenly going to come to their senses, I'm afraid, is not true. Putin is behaving like a rational actor, according to his view of the world, which is very, very violently opposed to that of the West. And he believes he is in conflict with NATO in Ukraine. And I think one just has to realise that.
Well, William Hague, I was asking about this earlier, the fact that, is it possible that, as the Ukrainians want, to retake the Crimean Peninsula, or is that the basis for a future peace negotiations if the Ukrainians manage to take back all of the rest of the territory that Russia has got since then?
I think, look, there are various options. The Ukrainians invade Crimea, they make progress, and Putin decides, right, I'm going to use nuclear weapons because Crimea is my red line. There's an option when the Ukrainians break through to the sea and get to the Sea of Azov. So they break through a lot of Russian lines, and at that point, Russia sues for peace, tries to keep something, and the West tries to persuade Zelenskyy to give up some land for peace. But it makes Zelenskyy very unpopular in Ukraine because the Ukrainians want all their country back, as it was in 2014, including the Crimea, including Donbass, and including Donetsk. Okay, so option 3 is a stalemate where the Russians throw vast amounts of men and machinery at the Ukrainians, but they don't get very far. But they do exist for the Ukrainians, so the Ukrainians can't make the progress they want, and the Russians now have some defense in depth. So there are lots of options. Unfortunately, the only good options dried up when this war started. So every option we face is a bad one or a disastrous one. That's why I argue that the least bad option is to make sure that we arm Ukrainians and arm them well enough to win, so that the Russians are put on the back foot and need to negotiate some kind of peace settlement where they can present some kind of face-saving measure. But even that will be a difficult sell to the Ukrainians. Right. Because if the Ukrainians can take all their country back, they will.
At Times Radio, we bring the front pages to life. Tune in to hear me, Kathy Newman, on Drive every Friday, 4 till 7.